They died because the exits were treated as theft risks, the warnings were ignored, and when accountability was tested in court, no one went to prison. The victims were not anonymous laborers swept up by chance. Most were young immigrant women, many teenagers, primarily Jewish and Italian, working long hours sewing women's blouses known as shirtwaists. They lived in crowded tenements, sent wages home to families, and relied on factory work that paid by the piece. Their vulnerability was structural, not accidental. They worked in a building designed for commerce, not safety, on upper floors where escape depended entirely on stairways, elevators, and fire escapes that had never been tested under crisis. Inside the factory, daily routines were rigid. Workers arrived early, clocked in, and were assigned rows of sewing machines packed closely together. Tables were stacked with cotton fabric and finished blouses, highly flammable materials. Scraps were swept into bins that were often left overflowing. Smoking was officially prohibited, but enforcement was inconsistent. The workforce was overwhelmingly female, supervised by male foremen. Doors were sometimes locked during work hours to prevent theft and unauthorized breaks. This practice was known to workers, protested by labor organizers, and tolerated by management. The factory occupied the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of a loft building. Multiple companies operated in the structure, but the Triangle Waste Company controlled the upper levels. The building had two staircases. One was routinely locked from the inside during work hours. The other opened inward, a critical flaw that would later prove deadly when crowds pressed against it. There was a fire escape, but it was narrow, poorly anchored, and had never been reinforced to carry large numbers of people at once. Elevators serviced the building, but they were slow and limited in capacity. The fire began during the workday, at a time when most workers were still at their machines. Flames were first noticed near a bin of fabric scraps beneath a cutting table. The precise ignition source was never definitively identified. Possibilities included a discarded match or cigarette, an electrical spark, or spontaneous ignition of lint and fabric dust. What is certain is that the fire spread with extreme speed, feeding on cotton, paper patterns, and wooden furniture. Within moments, flames climbed upward, driven by air currents and fueled by stacked materials. Workers closest to the fire attempted to extinguish it with buckets of water, but the blaze had already grown beyond control. Panic followed not from hysteria, but from the rapid collapse of escape options. On one floor, workers ran to the familiar exit, only to find the door locked. They tried to force it open, but it would not move. Others turned toward the second stairway, but smoke quickly filled the narrow passage. The inward opening door jammed as bodies pressed forward. Those behind could not see what blocked the way. They kept pushing. Elevator operators continued running cars as long as they could, making repeated trips, despite smoke and heat. Elevators filled beyond capacity. Some workers leapt down the shafts when the cars stopped running, attempting to slide along cables or land on top of descending cars. Many died in the attempt. The fire escape failed almost immediately. As dozens crowded onto it, the structure twisted and collapsed, sending people falling to the ground below. Those still inside watched their last external escape disappear. Firefighters arrived quickly, but were powerless. Their ladders reached only to the 6th floor. The fire burned above them. Fire hoses lacked sufficient water pressure to reach the upper levels. Nets were deployed, but the force of falling bodies tore them apart. People began jumping from windows, not because they chose to die, but because every other option had already failed. Within minutes, the fire was over. The building itself remained standing. Inside, bodies were piled near locked doors and jammed stairways. Others lay at the bottom of elevator shafts. Many were burned beyond recognition. Identification relied on personal effects, dental records, and testimony from co-workers and families. In total, 146 people were killed. The majority were women under the age of 25. Some were as young as 14. Survivors carried physical injuries, but also the burden of knowing how many deaths were preventable. The investigation began immediately, but its scope was limited from the start. Inspectors focused on identifying the fire's origin and determining whether criminal negligence could be proven. Evidence was destroyed by the fire itself. Records were incomplete. Witnesses gave conflicting accounts, shaped by trauma and fear of retaliation. Attention quickly turned to the factory owners. They had authority over building use, safety measures, and workplace rules. They were aware of locked doors. Testimony from workers confirmed the practice, yet proving that the specific door was locked at the moment of the fire and that management ordered it locked became the central legal hurdle. Prosecutors charged the owners with manslaughter. The case hinged on whether they knew the door was locked during work hours. Witnesses testified that doors were routinely locked. Defense attorneys emphasized uncertainty. They highlighted inconsistencies in testimony, differences in memory, and the chaos of the event. They argued that no witness could definitively state the owners had direct knowledge of the locked door on that specific day. The jury acquitted the owners. The legal standard required proof beyond reasonable doubt. The verdict stunned the public. Many believed the outcome reflected not innocence, but the limitations of existing law. The owners later settled civil suits, paying financial compensation that amounted to far less than the profits earned by the company over time. The investigation revealed broader failures. Building codes were inadequate. Fire safety regulations were fragmented and poorly enforced. Inspectors were few, underfunded, and often lacked authority to shut down unsafe operations. Factory owners faced little incentive to invest in safety improvements that did not directly increase productivity. Public reaction was intense and sustained. Mass funerals drew enormous crowds. Labor organizations seized the moment to demand reform. Journalists documented the conditions inside factories with new urgency. The fire became a reference point in debates about industrial capitalism, immigrant labor, and the responsibility of employers. Legislative action followed, but not automatically. Reform required sustained pressure. Committees were formed to investigate factory conditions across the state. Thousands of workplaces were inspected. Testimony from workers, engineers, and safety experts documented hazards that mirrored those at Triangle: locked exits, insufficient fire escapes, overcrowding, and flammable materials stored without safeguards. As a result, sweeping changes were enacted. New laws mandated unlocked exits, outward opening doors, fire drills, automatic sprinklers, and improved fire escapes. Working hours were regulated. Child labor restrictions were strengthened. These reforms transformed industrial safety standards nationwide. Yet unresolved questions remain. The exact cause of ignition was never conclusively determined. No individual was held criminally responsible for the deaths. The acquittal raised enduring concerns about how legal systems handle corporate negligence. The line between accident and crime remained blurred. There were also unanswered questions about enforcement. Even after new laws were passed, compliance depended on inspections and penalties that varied by jurisdiction. Some factories resisted changes until forced. Others found ways around regulations. The legacy of the fire was progress, but also a reminder that reform often follows catastrophe rather than preventing it. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire is remembered not only for the scale of loss, but for the clarity it brought to systemic failure. The deaths were not the result of a single spark, but of decisions layered over time: cost-cutting over safety, productivity over preparedness, legal tolerance over accountability. The building survived, the industry adapted, the law evolved, but the central discomfort remains. The danger was known, the warnings were documented, the exits were locked anyway,